When my grandfather passed away, I never imagined he had left me anything substantial. He had always been a quiet, hard-working man, one who valued family but never spoke much about money. So when the lawyer handed me a thick envelope at the reading of his will, I felt a lump form in my throat. Inside was a letter written in his familiar, careful handwriting. "My dear grandson, Thomas, if you are reading this, it means I am no longer here. I have always believed in you, and I want to give you something that will secure your future. I am leaving you $1.5 million, money that I worked hard to save, money that I trust you will use wisely. Speak to Mr. Caldwell. He will ensure everything is handled properly." My heart pounded. I had never seen that kind of money in my life. I looked up at the lawyer, Mr. Caldwell, who nodded solemnly. "Your grandfather wanted this to be a private matter," he said. "The funds were placed in a trust under my management until you were ready to claim them." I could barely process the words. My parents had passed when I was young, and my grandfather had been my guiding light. This was his final gift to me, a way to ensure I could build something meaningful. I left the lawyer's office in a daze, clutching the letter tightly. But as I reached my car, something nagged at me. Why hadn't I received this money earlier? Why was I only hearing about it now, months after my grandfather's passing? I had no idea that the answer would turn my entire world upside down. I spent the next few days trying to wrap my head around my grandfather's letter. $1.5 million. Where was it? Mr. Caldwell had spoken as if the money was still there, waiting for me, but something didn't sit right. On the third day, I called his office. "Mr. Caldwell, I need to know the exact details of how this trust was handled," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He hesitated. "Thomas, I assumed you already received the funds. Your grandfather's estate was settled months ago." The room spun. "Months ago?" "Yes," he said. "Your aunt handled the final paperwork. She confirmed that the money was transferred." I nearly dropped the phone. My aunt, my father's sister, Evelyn, was in charge of settling my grandfather's affairs. She had always been involved, but she had never once mentioned my inheritance. "Mr. Caldwell," I said, my voice cold, "I never saw a single dollar of that money." There was silence on the other end. That doesn't make sense. The funds were legally transferred to a beneficiary account under your name." I clenched my jaw. "Then someone else has been using my name." A pit formed in my stomach as the realization hit me. My own aunt had taken the money, and I had no idea how deep the betrayal went. I didn't want to believe it. Aunt Evelyn had always been family. She wasn't the warmest person, but she had been there for me after my parents passed. Could she really have stolen my inheritance? I needed proof. I met Mr. Caldwell at his office the next morning. He was already flipping through files when I arrived, his face pale. "Thomas, I don't know how this happened," he muttered, shaking his head. "Everything appeared to be in order at the time." He pushed a set of documents toward me. They were official-looking bank forms, signed with my name. Except it wasn't my signature. The handwriting was close, but not perfect. The longer I stared, the more obvious the differences became. "Someone forged my signature," I said. My voice felt distant, as if it belonged to someone else. Caldwell exhaled sharply. "And I'm afraid that someone also transferred the funds from the original account into a private one. That account was closed 6 months ago." "Who controlled that account?" I asked, already knowing the answer. Caldwell hesitated, then turned the page. There, in black ink, was the name of the beneficiary, Evelyn Carter. My aunt? The betrayal hit me like a punch to the gut. She had taken the money, my money, and disappeared it right under my nose. But why? I thought about calling her immediately, but I knew better. If she had gone this far, she wouldn't just admit it over the phone. No, I needed to be careful. If I wanted my grandfather's money back, I would have to outsmart her. And for that, I needed to know exactly what she had done with it. I left Mr. Caldwell's office with my head spinning. My aunt had stolen my inheritance. There was no doubt now. But where had the money gone? Had she spent it all? Hidden it? Invested it somewhere I couldn't reach? I drove straight to Evelyn's house, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. She lived in a modest two-story home on the edge of town, the kind of place that screamed quiet luxury. But as I pulled up to the curb, something felt off. Her car wasn't in the driveway. The house was dark. I knocked on the door, my heart pounding. No answer. I tried again, harder this time. Nothing. She wasn't home. Or worse, she was avoiding me. I stood on her porch for a long moment, debating my next move. Calling her would be pointless. She'd probably feed me some excuse, pretend she didn't know what I was talking about. I needed leverage before confronting her. Then I noticed something. A stack of unopened mail stuffed into the mailbox. A few envelopes had even fallen to the ground. That was odd. Evelyn was always meticulous about her finances. I picked up one of the envelopes and flipped it over. It was from a bank. Another was from a law firm I didn't recognize. A third was a past due notice from a credit card company. A sinking feeling settled in my stomach. Evelyn wasn't just hiding from me. She was in trouble. I spent the rest of the day tracking down leads. First, I called the bank listed on the envelope. Predictably, they refused to disclose any information about Evelyn's accounts. But that didn't mean I was out of options. If she was in financial trouble, there had to be a record of it. A public one. I searched through court filings, property records, anything I could think of. It took hours, but eventually, I found something. A lawsuit. A major one. Evelyn was being sued by multiple creditors. Over the past year, she had borrowed heavily, personal loans, credit lines, even a second mortgage on her house. The numbers were staggering. Hundreds of thousands of dollars, all gone. And then it hit me. She had used my inheritance to cover her debts. My grandfather's money, the fortune he had left for me to build a future, was nothing more than a bandage for my aunt's reckless spending. I stared at the documents on my screen, my hands shaking with rage. Evelyn hadn't just stolen from me. She had destroyed my grandfather's legacy. I didn't sleep that night. I kept playing different scenarios in my head, trying to figure out what to do next. Legal action? That would take time. And if the money was gone, a lawsuit wouldn't magically bring it back. Should I go straight to Evelyn? Confront her with everything I'd found? No. She'd lie, twist the truth. I needed something concrete, something she couldn't talk her way out of. So the next morning, I did something I never thought I'd do. I hired a private investigator. His name was Daniel Graves, and he had the kind of no-nonsense attitude I needed. He listened as I laid out the whole situation, nodding occasionally. "So," he said finally, "you want proof of where the money went, and you want it fast." "Exactly," I said. He leaned back in his chair, considering. "That kind of digging isn't cheap. Neither was the money she stole from me." A slow grin spread across his face. "Fair enough." He pulled out a notepad and started jotting things down. "Give me a week. I'll find out exactly what she's been up to." I shook his hand and left his office, my heart pounding. Now it was only a matter of time before the truth came to light. But I had no idea just how deep my aunt's deception went. The waiting was the hardest part. Every day that passed without news from Daniel Graves felt like torture. I kept running through scenarios in my mind. What if the money was completely gone? What if Evelyn had stashed it somewhere out of reach? On the fourth day, my phone buzzed. "Graves, we need to meet." Found something big. I rushed to his office, my pulse hammering in my ears. When I arrived, he was already sitting at his desk, a thick folder open in front of him. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Your aunt's financial mess is even worse than we thought," he said, flipping through the pages. "She's been drowning in debt for years, gambling, bad investments, loans she couldn't repay. But here's where it gets interesting." He slid a bank statement across the desk. My eyes widened. A deposit of $1.5 million. And then, just a few weeks later, withdrawals. Large ones. $50,000 here, $100,000 there. The money had disappeared fast, scattered across multiple accounts and payments to names I didn't recognize. "She laundered it," I muttered, my stomach twisting. Graves nodded. "Not professionally, but enough to make tracking it difficult." The good news? She was sloppy. She tried to cover her tracks, but there are still trails leading back to her. I clenched my fists. "So where is she now?" Graves hesitated. "That's the other thing." He pulled out a surveillance photo. My breath caught. Evelyn, standing outside a high-end casino in another state. Dressed well, smiling, carrying herself like someone who had money to burn. "She's been gambling," Graves said. "A lot." I ran a hand through my hair. "Tell me she hasn't lost it all." "That's the million-dollar question," he said. "Literally." I drove straight to Evelyn's house, fueled by anger and desperation. I didn't care if she was avoiding me. I wasn't leaving without answers. This time, when I knocked, the door opened. She stood there in a silk robe, her hair slightly disheveled. For a moment, I saw a flicker of something in her eyes, guilt maybe. But it vanished as quickly as it had come. "Thomas," she said smoothly, as if nothing had happened. "I wasn't expecting you." I pushed past her into the house. "Cut the act, Evelyn. We need to talk." She closed the door behind me, crossing her arms. "I assume this is about the money." I turned to face her. "You stole from me." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "I didn't." I cut her off. "Don't lie. I have proof. Bank records, transactions, everything." For the first time, she looked genuinely nervous. "Thomas, listen, I was in a tough spot. You forged my signature, emptied the account, and used my inheritance to cover your debts and gamble." My voice was rising, but I didn't care. "Did you even think about what Grandpa wanted? What that money was supposed to mean to me?" She exhaled sharply, her composure slipping. "I was going to pay it back." I laughed bitterly. "With what? Your next winning bet?" Silence. "How much is left?" I asked, my voice low and dangerous. Evelyn hesitated, her fingers twitching. I don't know exactly." Rage boiled inside me. "Then you'd better find out. Because one way or another, I'm getting that money back." As I left her house, my phone buzzed again. It was Graves. "Got something new," he said. "Evelyn didn't just gamble. She made a deal with someone dangerous. A loan shark." My blood ran cold. Evelyn hadn't just stolen my inheritance. She had gotten herself tangled in something much worse. I barely had time to process what Graves had told me before he sent me an address. "Meet me here. You need to see this for yourself." I pulled up to a dimly lit parking lot behind an old strip mall. Graves was leaning against his car, flipping through a folder. When I stepped out, he handed it to me. Inside were more surveillance photos. Evelyn, meeting with a man outside a casino. A different shot of her handing him an envelope. Another of him grabbing her arm. "Who is he?" I asked, my voice tense. "Name's Victor Morelli," Graves said. "Not your average debt collector. He runs underground gambling rings, money laundering operations, the whole 9 yards. If Evelyn owed him money and couldn't pay, He let the sentence hang. I swallowed hard. What does that mean for me? Graves shrugged. Depends. If she told him she had a way to get the money, like your inheritance, then he might be watching you too. My stomach twisted. So she stole from me to pay off a criminal. And now what? She still owes him? Graves nodded. Looks that way. I ran a hand through my hair, trying to steady myself. Does Morelli know the money came from me? Not yet, Graves said. But if Evelyn doesn't come up with more cash soon, he'll start digging. And trust me, you don't want him looking your way. I clenched my jaw. Then we need to stop this before it gets any worse. That night, I confronted Evelyn again. This time, she didn't bother pretending. How much do you owe Morelli? I demanded. She rubbed her temples, sinking into the couch. It was supposed to be a quick fix. Just a loan to help me through. How much, Evelyn? She hesitated, then whispered, 200 grand. I nearly staggered backward. 200? Are you insane? Tears welled in her eyes. I thought I could win it back. I had a system. I was so close, Thomas. You weren't close to anything, I shouted. You stole my inheritance, burned through it like it was nothing, and now you have a loan shark breathing down your neck. She broke down then, sobbing into her hands. For the first time, I saw how scared she really was. But I couldn't afford to pity her, not yet. Does Morelli know where I live? I asked. She shook her head. No, I never told him about you. But if he finds out, I have family with money. I exhaled sharply. Then we're both in danger. She looked up at me, eyes desperate. Please, Thomas. I know I screwed up, but I don't know what to do. I didn't have an answer. But I knew one thing. If Morelli found out about me, I'd have more than just lost money to worry about. I had to end this before it got worse. I barely slept that night. My mind was racing with one terrifying question. What would Morelli do when Evelyn couldn't pay? I had seen enough movies to know how these things worked. People like Morelli didn't just send polite reminders. They sent warnings, violent ones. And if Evelyn was out of money, that meant I was the next best target. By morning, I had made a decision. I wasn't going to wait for Morelli to come to me. I was going to find him first. Graves wasn't thrilled with my plan. You want to go knocking on a loan shark's door? He said, arms crossed. That's a good way to end up in a ditch. I'm not just going to sit around and wait for him to find me. I shot back. Evelyn's not going to fix this, and the longer we wait, the worse it gets. Graves sighed, rubbing his temples. All right. But you're not walking in there blind. He slid a piece of paper across the desk. An address. That's where Morelli runs his side business. Private poker games, high-stakes betting. He's got money flowing in and out constantly. I took the paper and stood. I'll handle it. Graves grabbed my wrist. No, Thomas. You'll go there, you'll keep your head down, and you'll let me handle the talking. I hesitated, then nodded. Because if I walked into this alone, I might not walk out. The address led us to a quiet bar on the outskirts of town. From the outside, it looked abandoned, faded neon signs, boarded-up windows. But as we walked around back, Graves pointed out the security cameras hidden in the corners. Morelli's got eyes everywhere, he murmured. Act like you belong. Inside, the air was thick with smoke and tension. Men in expensive suits sat at round tables, stacks of chips in front of them. A few glanced up as we entered, but no one said a word. At the far end of the room, a man leaned against the bar, sipping whiskey. He was older, but not frail. Broad shoulders, slicked back hair, a scar running down his left cheek. Victor Morelli. His gaze flicked to Graves first, then to me. He set his glass down and smiled, a slow, knowing grin. "Well, well," he said. Evelyn's boy finally decided to show up. My stomach clenched. He knew who I was. "Sit," Morelli said, motioning to the stool beside him. I hesitated. Graves gave me a slight nod, so I lowered myself onto the stool, keeping my expression blank. "Your aunt," Morelli continued, swirling the ice in his glass, "has made quite a mess of things." I clenched my fists. "I know. She owes me a lot of money," he said, his voice smooth but firm. "And from what I hear, she's fresh out of cash." I swallowed. "That's not my problem." Morelli chuckled. "See, that's where you're wrong. Family takes care of each other, right?" Graves cut in before I could respond. "Evelyn stole that money. Thomas didn't see a dime of it." Morelli waved a hand dismissively. "Doesn't matter. The money's gone, and I need payment." He turned to me, his smile fading. "So the question is, how do you plan on settling Evelyn's debt?" My heart pounded. "I don't." Silence. Morelli exhaled through his nose, then leaned in closer. "That's the wrong answer, kid." I forced myself to hold his gaze. "I didn't borrow from you. I don't owe you a thing." His jaw tightened. "Maybe not, but Evelyn does. And if she can't pay—" His fingers tapped the bar once, twice. "Well, let's just say I always collect my debts." I felt Graves stiffen beside me. Morelli leaned back, watching me. "Tell you what. I'll give you an option. You find a way to get me my money, or I take collateral." A chill ran down my spine. "What kind of collateral?" He smiled. "You?" I tensed. "Not forever," Morelli continued. "Just until Evelyn pays up. A little work here and there. Odd jobs. Things that make me money." I didn't like the sound of that. At all. Graves spoke up, his voice level. "You don't want to do that, Morelli. You take him, and I start making things difficult for you." Morelli chuckled, sipping his whiskey. "Relax. It's just business." Then he turned back to me. "You've got 3 days," he said. "Find me something. Cash, assets, anything. Or I'll collect in my own way." He smiled, clinked his glass against the bar, and walked away. Graves grabbed my arm. "We're leaving. Now." We barely spoke on the drive back. My mind was racing too fast to process everything. 3 days. I had 3 days to fix this before Morelli decided to take matters into his own hands. And the worst part? Evelyn had already lost the money, which meant I had nothing to bargain with. I was out of time. Back at my apartment, Graves paced the living room while I sat on the couch, my hands gripping my temples. 3 days, I muttered. How am I supposed to come up with that kind of money in 3 days? Graves stopped pacing. You're not. But Morelli doesn't just want money. He wants control. If we can find something more valuable than cash, we might be able to make a deal. I looked up at him. Like what? He pulled out his phone and started typing. Morelli's entire operation runs on secrecy. Money laundering, illegal gambling. He stays out of trouble because no one can prove anything. But if we find something incriminating, I sat up straighter. We could use it as leverage. Graves nodded. Exactly. If we give him a choice between getting his money or having his empire collapse, he'll take the money. It was risky, dangerous even. But what other choice did I have? Where do we start? I asked. Graves smirked. I've got a lead. That night, we drove to a club Morelli owned, the Velvet Ace. It was a front, just like his other businesses. The real action happened in the VIP rooms, where high rollers played for more than just cash. Graves had managed to get us in with fake credentials. We weren't there to gamble. We were there to listen. Inside, the atmosphere was electric. Laughter, clinking glasses, the rustle of chips being stacked. But Graves wasn't focused on the games. He was watching Morelli's men, tracking their movements. After an hour, he nudged me. "There," he whispered, nodding toward a door guarded by 2 men. "That's where they keep the records." I took a deep breath. "So how do we get inside?" Graves grinned. "We cheat." Graves distracted the guards by starting an argument at one of the tables, knocking over drinks and yelling about being cheated. While everyone was focused on him, I slipped through the door. Inside, I found a dimly lit office. Filing cabinets lined the walls, but I went straight to the desk, rifling through paperwork. And then I found it, a ledger. Inside were names, dates, and transaction amounts, proof of illegal dealings, rigged bets, and payouts to corrupt officials. Jackpot. I pulled out my phone and took as many photos as I could before slipping back out. By the time I returned to the main room, Graves was already waiting by the exit. "Got it?" he asked as we hurried outside. I nodded, breathless. "Yeah. And it's enough to bury Morelli." Graves exhaled. "Then we just found our bargaining chip." Now all we had to do was use it before Morelli realized we were playing a game of our own. The next morning, I sent a single text to Morelli. "We need to talk. I have something you'll want." His reply was immediate. "Tonight. My place. Come alone." Graves didn't like it, but we both knew I had no choice. That night, I walked into Morelli's lounge, the ledger tucked inside my jacket. He sat in his usual spot, watching me with amusement. "You've got my money?" he asked. I pulled out my phone instead, flipping through the photos of his records. "No," I said. "But I have this." His smile faded. I placed my phone on the table and slid it toward him. "This goes public if anything happens to me. You walk away from Evelyn's debt, and I walk away without a problem." Morelli leaned forward, studying me. For a long moment, the room was silent. Then he chuckled. "You've got guts, kid." He picked up my phone, deleted the photos, and tossed it back. "Deal," he said. I exhaled, trying to steady my hands. "Now get out," Morelli added. "And tell your aunt she's out of chances." I didn't need to be told twice. I left without looking back. The moment I stepped outside, I felt the weight lift from my chest. Morelli had agreed to the deal, but I knew better than to think I had one. People like him didn't forget. Evelyn was safe, for now. But she had burned every bridge. When I got to her house, she was waiting, her face pale. "Is it over?" she asked. I nodded. "Morelli's backing off. But you're out of luck, Evelyn. No more money. No more second chances." Tears welled in her eyes. "I didn't mean for it to go this far, Thomas." I shook my head. "You didn't care how far it went. Grandpa trusted you, and you threw it away." She opened her mouth to argue but stopped. Maybe, for the first time, she realized there was nothing left to say. I turned to leave. "We're done, Evelyn. Whatever happens next, you're on your own." She didn't stop me. In the weeks that followed, I started over. I took on extra work, built my savings from scratch. The inheritance was gone, but I refused to let it define me. As for Evelyn, she sold her house and left town, disappearing like a ghost. I didn't look for her. Some betrayals are too deep to forgive. And some lessons, no matter how painful, change you forever. The end.